Hi guys, welcome back. Welcome back to Chapter 2. Before we begin, please download Chapter 2, the methodology, just below this video. Click on the link in the description box and you'll be able to download the Chapter 2 template. Your Chapter 2 will broadly consist of these sections. You'll have a mini introduction, discussion about your study design, your literature search strategy, your databases, websites, keywords, Boolean and inclusion and exclusion criteria. We'll look at the sources you used, the limitations of the entire approach, your data analysis, and any ethical considerations. And we'll go through each of these aspects in more detail. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 of your dissertation will both need a mini introduction and a mini conclusion, or a mini summary. This is vital that you start Chapter 2 with a mini intro and that you start Chapter 3 with a mini intro. And in your introduction, you very briefly state the aim of the section. You also state the significance of this chapter to the wider thesis. What role does this chapter play? You can also say. And lastly, how is your methodology section arranged? So these three questions, you'll try to answer them. And I've got an example in the template of how a student went about this. So what is the aim of your section? And you can either answer what is the significance of this chapter, or what role does this chapter play? And of course you will end by discussing the order of your methodology section. Methodology will begin with this, will commence with this will be followed by this will be followed by this. A very simple intro. Please don't try to make this too long. 2 or 3 sentences is fine. The next section is your study design or your research design. In this section, you'll define what is a study design. I have an example here. And you also talk about your study design. Your study design is grounded in secondary research. So you will discuss a number of things in this section. What is secondary research? What is primary research? What are the advantages of secondary research over primary research? So because you have selected secondary research, it's very important that you talk about the advantages of using secondary research. Why did you choose secondary research? What were the reasons? What were the advantages? And what are the disadvantages of secondary research? What are the limitations of using secondary research? How can you overcome these disadvantages? It's not good enough to just say the disadvantages. In order to have much more critical analysis, you'll need to discuss how you can overcome these disadvantages. And please discuss with your supervisor whether to discuss or whether to write about qualitative versus quantitative. Some supervisors want you to write about qualitative and quantitative information, but please discuss this with your supervisor and please discuss this approach. This example does not include qualitative and quantitative because it differs between supervisors. So please discuss this aspect with your supervisor. So in this study design section, you answer all of these questions. When you are writing your methodology, every section, you should try to make it as specific as possible. Many methodologies that I come across are too general, they are too generic. So I have here an example. Example 1 and example 2. Both of these examples are essentially saying the same thing, but one is much more specific. So in terms of the first example, secondary research is less consuming than primary research, less time consuming than primary research. However, we see with this example, the second example is far more specific to their research question, to their research area. Given the large amount of research on HIV/AIDS amongst Black Africans, it will be more time consuming to undertake primary research. So they're essentially saying the same thing, however, there's much more detail in the second example. And also they referenced reference as much as possible in your methodology. Another example, very generic, very vague. Secondary research is less costly than primary research. That is true, but it's always better to make it much more specific. So we have another example of being much more specific, where they've essentially saying the same thing about it being less costly. However, they've made it relevant to their particular dissertation. And you can see the difference in these two examples. The methodology essentially is about you discussing every single step you went through to get your information. So you will look at your literature search strategy, you will lay out the blueprint, you lay out your plan. So you describe what a literature search strategy is, and also what steps did you take. Here is a breakdown of all of the crucial steps of your literature search strategy. You looked at databases, you looked at websites, use keywords, use Boolean operators. Whatever your search included, you'll state it within this section. And try to make it relevant to your specific study as we discussed in a previous slide. The marker the assessors will look at if you have included this within your entire dissertation. For example, you stated that you use EBSCOhost, JSTOR, Academic Search Complete, British Medical Journal, PubMed. You use all of these sources, but it's not present in your literature review. It's not present anywhere in your dissertation. They'll mark you down on this account. So make sure any database that you've listed, you've actually engaged with it. Any website that you've listed, you've actually engaged with it. Your keywords and your Boolean, make sure you actually use those things because it'll be reflective in your wider dissertation. Also, and justify your sources. When you discuss your databases, justify why those databases. When you discuss your websites, justify why those particular websites. When you use keywords and Boolean operators, why those particular keywords and why the Boolean operators. Really try to justify every step that you're taking. So not only in the methodology do you outline every step you take you should justify. Can you turn your attention now to 2.3 data analysis? Here you will talk about the type of data analysis that you will employ in your literature review, the following chapter, chapter 3. How will you analyze all this data? You've gathered all of this information, all of this data. How will you analyze this data? How will you organize this data? And one way of organizing this data is a thematic analysis. You will essentially divide all of your data up into 4 themes. And your 4 themes will essentially be your 4 objectives. And we will discuss that in chapter 3. But just for now in the methodology, it's important that you show the person looking at your work how you will organize your information, how will you organize your data. And this is always a good place to discuss this section with your supervisor. And as I said, the thematic analysis is a way to analyze data, because if you don't use this, your data will be one big blob. So by dividing your data into those 4 themes, your objectives, you really show organization and you really show that you're able to take this mass pile of data, journals, articles, books, studies, legislation, and you're able to put it in defined themes. This is very important. So think about which themes will you use for your literature review. Most students will use their objectives. 99.9% you will use your objective as themes. So the first objective around prevalence will be a theme. Second objective about factors will be a theme. Third objectives about outcomes will be a theme. Fourth objective about government intervention will be a theme. So you will use these themes in your literature review. limitations in this section. You'll discuss the limitations of your literature search strategy. What obstacles, what hurdles did you come across when you was gathering information? And also, you'll speak about how did you mitigate, how did you safeguard against these obstacles? How were you able to bypass these obstacles? So there are a number of limitations for your study which you can mention. Perhaps there was a small amount of studies in your area. You was looking at prostate cancer amongst a particular demographic and you found there wasn't much literature. Please mention this. That is a limitation of your study. Maybe you found that the information on your target group was limited. Maybe a lot of information needs to be translated. There are more studies in the US and less studies in the UK, more studies in Europe, less studies in the UK. There's no recent data. Maybe the latest data you have is 2015, 2016. This is a limitation. Maybe the limitations would be that 6 studies are not accessible through the London Metropolitan Academic Search Complete, so you had to go through a different avenue. Maybe it was much more costly. And once you state your limitations, you have to think of a solution. Once you state your limitations, it's important that you think of a solution. You can't just say, there are no studies. How did you address this? How did you bypass this? How were you able to mitigate this? And this is very important. And if you don't know, ask your supervisor or ask Denise Adams, your librarian. So think of the limitations of your study and how did you counter the limitations. So limitation, solution. Write a limitation, write a solution. Write a limitation, write a solution. And generally most people will have 2 or 3 limitations. And writing that solution is very important because if you just write limitations, then a question beckons. Why did you choose to research this topic if there's so much limitations? So it's imperative that you think of a solution, a remedy to counteract these limitations. Towards the end of chapter 2, you will define ethical considerations. What are ethical considerations? What are their importance? What is the importance of considering these ethical issues? Most importantly though, you'll clearly state, be very explicit, what are the ethical considerations that are relevant for your particular study. True depiction of information, you'll be concerned with that. You will consider that to faithfully depict what is in the journal article, to faithfully depict what is in the publication. Also, a consideration will be ownership of the original data must be acknowledged and avoidance of plagiarism. It's very important also to have knowledge of the scholar that produced the work. Take care to evaluate the robustness and fairness of scholarship. This will be an ethical consideration for you. And since there is no ethical board to consult with, many of these ethical issues you'll be faced with by yourself. So bear this in mind as well. Even though it's secondary research, there are still ethical constraints, ethical considerations that you will have to consider, and it may differ from study to study. But also have a discussion with your supervisor about this. Ethical tensions. What ethical tensions are there? If you want to get more marks and show some critical analysis, it's always good to think about ethical tensions and ethical conflicts. As you was gathering all of this information, did you have any tensions, any conflicts, any controversies? For instance, if the study is heavily criticized, will you still use it? And why? If the study is valid, is from a peer-reviewed journal repository, but is criticized by its peers, will you still use it? And why? That's a tension there. Should I use it? Because it is a valid study from a valid repository. However, it has been criticized. So here is a tension. So try to think about any tensions that you can discuss within this ethical section of your work. I have here a scenario. If there's a study about the experience of stigma of gay men, but it's conducted by an individual outside of the LGBTQI community, is there any tension there? Is there any tension if the study is conducted by an individual within the LGBTQI community? Is there a tension there? Is there any conflict? These are just examples of things to think about when thinking about ethical tensions, ethical conflicts. It's very difficult to think of tensions within a secondary research framework. Most of these tensions are within primary research. So when you undertake primary research, there are a number of tensions and conflicts that you are faced with. So try to think of an example within secondary research of these particular tensions. Coming to the end of chapter 2, it's very important that you summarize the chapter, that you provide a mini conclusion, a mini summary right at the end of the chapter, and keep it very simple and to the point. Don't make it too long, but also after you summarize the chapter, prepare the reader for the next chapter. In this example, the student has written, what follows this chapter is a review of the findings. So they're leading the reader and they're preparing the reader for chapter 3. This is very important. In summary, be very, very specific when you are writing your methodology. Be specific in your study design, in the databases you use, the websites, sources used, limitations. Every section of your methodology, be very specific and make sure it's relevant to your particular topic. Reference as much as possible. I can't emphasize that enough. Reference as much as possible. There are a number of good general research books out there for you to reference. Make sure your methodology is reliable. If you mention about a particular source that you use or a database or keywords, make sure you actually did it. Everything in your methodology you should have actually done. So make sure that it is reliable.